Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, listen closely. Can you hear it? The wind moving through broken marble columns, the distant echo of waves against a forgotten harbor, the soft murmur of a city that once ruled the ancient world. More than 2,000 years ago, where the Nile meets the Mediterranean, there rose a dynasty of brilliant minds and dangerous desires. Greek kings wearing the crowns of pharaohs, builders of the greatest library humanity ever knew, and architects of their own destruction through power, blood, and silence. Tonight, we drift through the rise and fall of the Ptolemaic Dynasty, a story of incest and ambition, knowledge and madness, love and inevitable collapse, all whispered gently through the sands of time. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or quietly reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let Alexandria return, not with noise, but with murmurs. Alexander the Great was dead. Not fallen in battle, not struck down by an enemy's blade, but gone quietly, suddenly, in a palace far from home. When the news spread, it moved like a cold wind across the known world. From Macedonia to Babylon, from the Aegean to the edges of India, an empire held together by one man's will began to crack. Generals whispered, courtiers hesitated, armies waited without orders. History often remembers Alexander as a god among men, but in death he was something far more dangerous, a symbol without an owner. His body lay still, but his legacy was restless, powerful, and uncontested. In the ancient world, the body of a king was not merely flesh and bone, it was authority made visible. Whoever controlled the remains of Alexander the Great could shape the story of who ruled in his shadow. As preparations began for an imperial funeral worthy of a conqueror who had never known defeat, few realized that the most important battle of the wars of the Diadochi would not be fought with swords or shields, but with a coffin. The planned destination for Alexander's body was Macedonia, the ancestral homeland of his dynasty, a place meant to anchor his legacy among his people. A golden funeral carriage was constructed, lavish beyond imagination, adorned with symbols of divinity, power, and cosmic order. It was designed to move slowly, deliberately, allowing every city it passed to witness the presence of the dead king and to remember who he had been. But as the procession prepared to leave Babylon, one man watched more closely than the others. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, a companion of Alexander since youth, a general who had marched beside him across deserts and mountains, understood something his rivals did not. Thrones could be claimed by force, but legitimacy was something far more fragile. Macedonia was crowded with ambition. Too many generals wanted to rule there. Too many knives waited in the dark. Egypt, by contrast, was different. Ancient, wealthy, stable, and sacred. A land where kings were not merely rulers, but living gods. Ptolemy did not want to fight endlessly for a title that could be taken from him tomorrow. He wanted permanence. He wanted Egypt. But to rule Egypt, he needed more than soldiers. He needed a god. And so, somewhere between Babylon and the Mediterranean, history took a silent turn. The golden carriage carrying the body of Alexander never reached its intended destination. In the open spaces between cities, under vast skies and shifting sands, Ptolemy acted. Sources differ on the details, as they always do when power rewrites memory, but the outcome is certain. The funeral procession was intercepted, redirected, taken. The body of Alexander the Great, conqueror of the known world, was claimed by one of his own generals.
It was not an act of desecration, but of audacity. Ptolemy did not hide what he had done. He brought the body to Egypt, first to Memphis, the ancient ceremonial heart of the land, and later to Alexandria, the city Alexander himself had founded. There, the conqueror would rest forever, not in the soil of Macedonia, but in the land of the pharaohs. With this single act, Ptolemy transformed himself. He was no longer just another successor fighting in the chaos of the wars of the Diadochi. He became the guardian of Alexander's physical legacy, the keeper of the god's body. In a world where myth and politics were inseparable, this mattered more than any battlefield victory. The presence of Alexander's tomb in Egypt sent a clear message to rivals and subjects alike. Power lived here now. Authority slept here. And as the city of Alexandria grew around the silent body of its founder, a new dynasty began to take shape, not through inheritance, but through theft, symbolism, and an unspoken claim that the divine had chosen a new home. This was not the end of Alexander's story. It was the beginning of something darker, quieter, and far more enduring.
The moment Alexander's body entered Egypt, the land itself seemed to respond. This was not merely a transfer of remains, but a transformation of meaning. Egypt had ruled by gods for thousands of years. Its people did not separate the divine from the political. Pharaohs were not elected, nor merely crowned. They were revealed, affirmed by ritual, burial, and the silent agreement between heaven and earth. Ptolemy understood this instinctively. By bringing the body of Alexander the Great into Egypt, he was not stealing a corpse, he was importing divinity. Memphis, where the body was first laid to rest, was no random choice. It was the ancient ceremonial heart of Egypt, a city heavy with tradition, where kings had been crowned and judged by the gods long before Greece was more than scattered tribes. There, priests performed rites, not for a foreign conqueror, but for a ruler who could now be woven into Egypt's sacred history. Alexander, in death, began to change. He was no longer just the Macedonian king who had shattered Persia. In Egypt, he became something older, quieter, and more eternal. He became a pharaoh. And by positioning himself as the guardian of this transformed Alexander, Ptolemy quietly stepped into a role that went far beyond that of a military governor. He did not rush to declare himself king. He did not need to. The message was already clear to those who understood symbols better than proclamations. While other successors fought openly, spilling blood across Asia Minor and Mesopotamia, Ptolemy ruled with patience. The wars of the Diadochi raged on, but Egypt remained strangely insulated. The Nile flowed, granaries stayed full, temples continued their rituals, and at the center of it all rested the body of the man who had once ruled them all. Rivals knew what this meant. Control of Alexander's tomb was control of memory, and memory was the most powerful weapon of all. To challenge Ptolemy in Egypt was not just to challenge an army, but to challenge the resting place of a god. Over time, Alexander's body was moved again, this time to Alexandria. The city itself was a statement, Greek in design, Egyptian in soul, facing the Mediterranean, yet rooted in the ancient land. Alexandria was the perfect stage for a new kind of power. There, Alexander's tomb became more than a burial site. It became a pilgrimage. Generals, kings, and later even Roman emperors would come to stand before the preserved body, to gaze upon the face of the conqueror and to measure themselves against his silent judgment. Each visit reaffirmed the city's importance, and by extension, the legitimacy of the dynasty that guarded it. Ptolemy's genius was not in conquest, but in containment. He did not chase the empire Alexander had built.
He anchored its spirit in one place and ruled that place absolutely. By the time Ptolemy formally took the title of king, becoming Ptolemy I, savior of Egypt, his position was already unassailable. He had done what none of the other Diadochi had managed to do. He turned chaos into continuity. He replaced endless war with ritual, myth, and stability. Yet beneath the calm surface, something darker had taken root. The act that founded the Ptolemaic Dynasty was an act of theft, not of gold or land, but of identity. By claiming Alexander's body, Ptolemy claimed the right to define who Alexander was and what his legacy meant. This subtle manipulation of memory would become a defining trait of the dynasty that followed. Power would be justified not only through force, but through stories, symbols, and carefully controlled narratives. The body of a god lay at the heart of it all, silent, unchanging, while generations fought, schemed, and killed in its shadow. And so, before the incest, before the murders, before the slow decay that would one day invite Rome's intervention, the Ptolemaic world was born in an atmosphere of incense, whispered prayers, and a single, irreversible decision made on a desert road.
As years passed, the presence of Alexander's body in Alexandria began to reshape the rhythms of power itself. The tomb was not loud, not dramatic, not surrounded by constant ceremony. Its strength lay in its stillness. In a city filled with voices, markets, scholars, and ships arriving from every corner of the Mediterranean, there was one place that remained untouched by time. The body of Alexander the Great rested there, preserved, silent, and eternal. This silence was deliberate. Ptolemy understood that true authority did not need constant proclamation. It needed continuity. Each sunrise over Alexandria reinforced the same unspoken truth. The conqueror had chosen this city as his final home, and the man who ruled beside his tomb ruled with his blessing. Visitors came quietly, some out of reverence, some out of calculation. To stand before Alexander was to remind oneself of ambition's limits. Even Roman leaders centuries later would seek out the tomb, measuring their own power against the stillness of a dead god. For the people of Egypt, the meaning was simpler and deeper. Alexander had become part of the land, and Ptolemy had become its rightful steward. This arrangement shaped the psychology of the dynasty that followed. Power was no longer something to be seized openly. It was something to be inherited through proximity, ritual, and control of symbols. The lesson was subtle but enduring. Whoever controlled the story controlled the throne. Over time, the Ptolemaic court absorbed this lesson fully. The rulers who came after Ptolemy I would not simply govern Egypt, they would perform it. Titles would grow longer, genealogies would grow more complex, ritual would become inseparable from rule. And at the center of it all, the silent presence of Alexander remained, reminding each generation that legitimacy was something to be guarded fiercely, even violently. The act that had begun the dynasty had also planted its future curse. If power came from sacred proximity, then family became the battlefield. Bloodlines mattered more than loyalty. Marriage became strategy. Kinship became threat. The tomb that once unified authority would, over generations, cast a long shadow. Brothers would learn to fear sisters. Parents would see rivals in their children. The calm exterior of the dynasty concealed a slow internal corrosion. Yet none of this was visible at the beginning. In these early years, Egypt was peaceful.
The Nile rose and fell as it always had. Alexandria flourished as a center of knowledge, trade, and quiet confidence. To the outside world, Ptolemy's Egypt seemed like a rare success story among the shattered remains of Alexander's empire. But beneath the surface, the rules had already been written. Power would be preserved at any cost. Memory would be shaped deliberately, and the divine would be used to justify the human. The body of a god had been taken, and with it came a model of rule that would define the Ptolemaic Dynasty for centuries. This was not merely the beginning of a royal line. It was the creation of a system where legitimacy depended on closeness to the sacred, and survival depended on control within the family. As night settles over Alexandria and the city's lights dim one by one, the tomb remains unchanged. The conqueror sleeps, the city breathes, and the dynasty, born of a single bold act on a desert road, begins its long journey toward glory, paranoia, and inevitable decay. In the next chapter, we will step away from the stillness of the tomb and into the living world it shaped, where power learned to wear ritual as armor, and family became both sanctuary and weapon.
Alexandria did not grow the way ancient cities usually did. It did not emerge slowly from ritual centers or sacred ground shaped by centuries of belief. It appeared with intention, drawn first as geometry in the mind before it rose as stone from the sand. Under the careful direction of Ptolemy I and later his son, this city was imagined as something new in the ancient world, a place where marble replaced mud brick, where straight lines challenged the organic curves of older Egyptian settlements, and where light itself seemed to be part of the design. Facing the sea, open to trade and ideas, Alexandria was built to look outward rather than inward, to welcome ships rather than priests. Yet beneath this openness lay a delicate problem that could not be solved by architecture alone. Alexandria was meant to be Greek in form and Egyptian in soul, but the people who lived there carried histories that did not easily blend. Greek settlers arrived with their language, their philosophy, and their gods, confident in their cultural inheritance. Egyptians remained deeply rooted in traditions that stretched back thousands of years, bound to rituals, symbols, and a religious worldview that shaped every aspect of daily life. They lived side by side, shared streets and markets, but did not truly merge. This quiet separation posed a greater threat to stability than any invading army. Ptolemy understood that walls and laws could not unite a divided city. Force could impose order, but it could not create loyalty. For Alexandria to survive, it needed something deeper, something that could speak to both populations without asking either to abandon who they were. This was where the true genius of the early Ptolemies revealed itself. Rather than attempting to erase difference, they chose to reshape belief itself. Religion in the ancient world was not merely faith, it was identity, community, and legitimacy woven together. To rule minds, one had to rule the sacred. And so, in the quiet halls of power, a decision was made that would redefine what political authority could be. A new god would be born, not discovered through prophecy, not inherited from ancient myth, but designed. Serapis emerged as an answer to a problem no army could solve. He was familiar yet new, comforting yet authoritative. His appearance echoed the Greek image of Zeus, bearded, calm, and commanding, embodying reason and cosmic order. But his essence carried the weight of Osiris, the Egyptian god of death, rebirth, and eternal continuity. To Greek eyes, Serapis felt intelligible, dignified, and rational. To Egyptians, he felt ancient, cyclical, and deeply sacred. This fusion was no accident. It was a carefully crafted bridge between worlds. Temples to Serapis rose in Alexandria,
spaces where Greek poems framed Egyptian rituals, where incense and philosophy shared the same air. Worship of Serapis did not demand that people forget their old gods. Instead, it invited them to reinterpret them through a shared symbol. This was political technology at its most subtle. There were no decrees forcing belief, no punishments for dissent. Instead, the city was gently guided toward a common dream. When people knelt before Serapis, they were not simply praying, they were participating in a shared narrative, one that quietly affirmed the legitimacy of the rulers who had given this god a home. The brilliance of this system lay in its invisibility. Power did not appear as coercion, it appeared as harmony. As Alexandria's streets filled with scholars, merchants, sailors, and pilgrims, the city began to feel unified, not because difference had vanished, but because it had been given a new language. This language was myth, carefully shaped and endlessly repeated. Over time, Serapis became more than a solution. He became the spiritual heartbeat of Alexandria, a reminder that unity could be constructed, belief could be guided, and dreams could be designed. In this city of marble and light, authority no longer rested solely on bloodlines or armies. It rested on imagination. And as night fell over the harbor, with waves whispering against stone and distant voices fading into sleep, Alexandria stood as a testament to a new kind of power, one that ruled not through fear, but through the quiet shaping of what people believed was real.
As Serapis quietly settled into the spiritual life of Alexandria, another force was rising alongside him, one that would reinforce the city's power in a different, more enduring way. Knowledge itself was being gathered, curated, and centralized. The Library of Alexandria did not exist merely as a collection of scrolls. It was conceived as an instrument of authority, a place where the world's understanding could be assembled under one roof. Ptolemy and his successors believed that to rule land was temporary, but to rule memory and learning was permanent. Scholars arrived from Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and beyond, drawn by patronage, safety, and the promise that their work would be preserved. Languages mingled as easily as incense smoke. Homer was studied beside Egyptian medical texts. Babylonian astronomy was translated into Greek. This blending of knowledge mirrored the blending of belief embodied by Serapis. Alexandria became not only a city of stone and marble, but a city of ideas, where identity was shaped not through conquest, but through interpretation. Yet even this intellectual openness was guided carefully. Knowledge was welcomed, but it was also categorized, copied, and controlled. The state decided which texts were preserved and which were quietly forgotten. Ships entering the harbor were required to surrender books for copying, their originals often kept, while copies were returned. This was not theft, but absorption. The city consumed the world's wisdom and made it its own. In this environment, Serapis functioned as a stabilizing presence. While scholars debated and cultures overlapped, the god offered a common spiritual center, a reassurance that beneath diversity lay unity. Temples and libraries worked together, not in conflict, but in balance. Faith soothed the masses, while knowledge elevated the elite. Both ultimately served the same purpose, reinforcing the legitimacy of the Ptolemaic rulers. This system did not rely on fear, it relied on participation. To live in Alexandria was to take part in a grand experiment, one where belief, learning, and governance were woven into a single fabric. People did not feel ruled, they felt included. This sense of inclusion was powerful, but it was also fragile. It depended on constant maintenance, on the careful alignment of symbols and stories. The Ptolemies understood that dreams, once broken, could turn into resentment. So they invested heavily in spectacle, ritual, and patronage.
Festivals honored Serapis with processions that blended Greek theatricality with Egyptian solemnity. Public spaces were designed to inspire awe rather than submission. Even the layout of the city encouraged movement and interaction, reinforcing the idea that Alexandria was not a foreign imposition, but a shared home. Over time, this approach reshaped how power was perceived. Authority became less visible, more atmospheric. It existed in the rhythm of daily life, in the comfort of familiar rituals, in the quiet assurance that the world made sense. Yet beneath this calm surface, the seeds of tension remained. The very tools that created unity also concentrated control. When belief and knowledge are curated from above, dissent becomes difficult to express, even harder to imagine. Alexandria's brilliance masked an underlying dependency on centralized authority. As long as the system functioned, it felt benevolent, but should it falter, the consequences would be profound. For now, however, the city thrived. At night, the harbor lights reflected on the water, scholars retired to their studies, and worshippers left the temples of Serapis with a sense of peace. Alexandria slept, wrapped in marble and dreams, unaware that the very mechanisms that made it so harmonious would one day amplify conflict within the dynasty itself.
In time, Alexandria began to believe in itself. This was perhaps the most remarkable achievement of all. Cities usually inherit their identity from the past, but Alexandria inherited its identity from intention. Marble avenues, libraries filled with whispered debate, temples where a newly formed god presided over ancient rites, all worked together to create the feeling that this place had always been meant to exist. Children grew up knowing no other world. Merchants measured time by the rhythm of the harbor. Scholars marked their lives by the accumulation of knowledge rather than the turning of seasons. And through it all, the figure of Serapis remained constant, a calm presence that asked for devotion without demanding transformation. The genius of this arrangement lay in its emotional economy. People were not asked to choose between cultures, they were invited to rest within a shared image. Greek and Egyptian identities did not disappear, but they softened the edges, wrapped in ceremony, festival, and daily habit. This softness made resistance unnecessary. When power feels like comfort, it rarely feels like oppression. Yet comfort has a way of becoming dependency. As generations passed, the city's unity came to rely increasingly on the careful maintenance of symbols. The god had to remain convincing. The rituals had to feel meaningful. The narrative had to be repeated, gently, endlessly. Authority was no longer defended by force, but by familiarity. Any disruption to this balance threatened not just order, but identity itself. This was the unseen cost of designed harmony. By shaping belief so carefully, the Ptolemies ensured stability, but they also narrowed the space for change. When belief is curated, imagination follows fixed paths. Alexandria's brilliance became a mirror that reflected the dynasty's ideals back at itself. The rulers came to see their own system as natural, inevitable, and divinely favored. This certainty was reassuring, but it was also dangerous. It encouraged inward focus, a turning away from the unpredictable world beyond the city's walls. While Alexandria slept peacefully under the watchful gaze of Serapis, tensions quietly gathered elsewhere, both within the royal family and beyond Egypt's borders. The same tools that unified the city could not prevent rivalry among those closest to power. In fact, they intensified it. When legitimacy rests on symbolism, proximity matters. When authority is inherited through ritual, bloodlines become everything. The dream that had united Greeks and Egyptians now began to harden into a framework that trapped the dynasty itself.
Family members grew up surrounded by ceremony, taught from birth that they were part of a sacred order, chosen, distinct, and irreplaceable. Love and trust became secondary to position. Marriage was no longer personal, it was structural. The city of marble had created a generation that understood power as something intimate, something passed through bodies as much as through titles. As night settles again over Alexandria, the harbor quiet, the library doors closed, and the temples dim, the dream remains intact. The city breathes slowly, secure in the harmony it believes to be eternal. But beneath this calm surface, the foundations are shifting. The mechanisms that once made unity possible are beginning to press inward, turning cohesion into confinement. In the next chapter, we will leave the wide avenues and shared rituals behind and step into the private chambers of the dynasty itself, where the logic of designed belief will take its most unsettling form, and where family becomes the final instrument of power.
Come with me now, not through deserts or battlefields, but through cool stone corridors where footsteps echo softly and time seems to slow. You are entering the Mauseon, the temple of the Muses, a place not built for worship in the usual sense, but for devotion of a different kind. Here, knowledge itself was sacred. This was the heart of the Library of Alexandria, a space imagined not merely as a building, but as a promise. The promise that all human understanding could be gathered, protected, and expanded in one place. As you walk through these halls in your mind, the air feels calm, deliberate, heavy with thought. Scrolls of papyrus line the walls, each one holding a fragment of the world's memory. Languages from distant lands rest side by side, translated, studied, compared. There is no urgency here, only patience. The Ptolemies believed that power anchored in knowledge would outlast power anchored in violence, and so they fed this institution with relentless determination. There was a rule, quietly enforced, known to every captain who approached the harbor of Alexandria. Any ship that docked was searched for books. Any text found was taken to the library, copied by skilled scribes, and only the copy was returned. The original remained. It was not considered theft, it was considered preservation. Alexandria did not borrow the world's knowledge, it absorbed it. Over time, this hunger for understanding became legendary. Scholars lived here at the state's expense, free to think, debate, and observe. They did not race against time, they studied it. In this environment, the boundaries between philosophy, science, and imagination dissolved. Mathematics became a language of beauty. Astronomy became a way to touch the divine. Geometry described not only shapes, but order itself. Somewhere within these halls, Euclid organized the principles of geometry so clearly that they would guide minds for more than 2,000 years. Nearby, Eratosthenes looked at shadows cast by the sun in two distant cities and realized that the Earth itself could be measured. Without satellites, without machines, using only observation and reason, he calculated the circumference of the planet with astonishing accuracy. The world, for the first time, became something finite, something that could be understood. And yet, even these achievements were not the most unsettling. In the workshops and margins of the library, imagination reached further still. Hero of Alexandria experimented with steam, heat, and motion, creating devices that moved by invisible force. His aelopile, a simple sphere spinning under the pressure of steam, was not a toy, it was a question. What else might be possible if such ideas were pursued, refined, shared? This was ancient technology standing on the edge of a future it would never reach.
The lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos, rose nearby as a physical symbol of this ambition. Towering above the sea, its fire guided ships safely to harbor, a beacon of human ingenuity visible for miles. Together, the library and the lighthouse represented two sides of the same dream. One illuminated the mind, the other illuminated the path. And for a brief moment in history, it seemed as though humanity was learning how to guide itself. As night falls in your imagination, the halls grow quieter. Scrolls rest where they were left. Lamps flicker softly. Outside, waves brush against stone, and the great lighthouse sends its steady signal into the dark. No one here knows what will be lost. No one senses the fragility of what has been built. They believe knowledge, once gathered, is safe forever. That belief is part of the dream.
There is a particular kind of silence that follows great understanding, and the Library of Alexandria knew this silence well. It was the quiet that comes after discovery, when the mind pauses, aware that something fundamental has shifted. Scholars here did not simply collect facts, they reshaped how reality itself could be perceived. When Eratosthenes calculated the size of the Earth, he did more than solve a problem. He collapsed distance. The world suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, measurable. Horizons lost their mystery, not because they vanished, but because they could be imagined. This shift mattered deeply. Once the Earth could be measured, it could be navigated with confidence. Trade routes became deliberate. Exploration became purposeful. The planet transformed from a mythic surface into a comprehensible whole. And yet, this knowledge was fragile. It existed in minds, in fragile papyrus, in conversations that could vanish with a single forgotten generation. The library worked tirelessly to guard against this fragility, but it was always fighting time itself. In the evenings, when scholars gathered beneath oil lamps, ideas flowed freely. They debated whether the universe was infinite or bounded, whether matter could be divided endlessly or not, whether time itself had a beginning. These were not idle questions. They were attempts to understand existence without relying on divine explanation alone. This was a radical act in the ancient world, and it happened quietly, almost gently within these walls. Hero of Alexandria embodied this spirit more than most. His devices, powered by steam and pressure, hinted at forces hidden beneath everyday experience. The Aeoli piles spun not because of magic, but because of natural law. Fire heated water, steam expanded, motion followed. This simple chain of cause and effect carried enormous implications. If invisible forces could be harnessed, then labor could be transformed, movement could be automated, energy could be redirected. The future whispered here, softly, centuries before it would be heard again. Yet, these ideas remained largely theoretical, admired but not industrialized. The world around the library was not ready. Social structures, economic systems, and political priorities did not align with such transformation. Knowledge raced ahead of society's capacity to absorb it, and so many ideas slept, preserved in scrolls, waiting for a time that would never come. The lighthouse of Alexandria stood as a counterpoint to this intellectual fragility. It was visible, solid, monumental. Its fire burned night after night, guiding sailors safely home. It symbolized applied knowledge, knowledge turned into stone and flame. Together, the lighthouse and the library formed a delicate balance between thought and action. One illuminated the sea, the other illuminated the mind.
Both required maintenance, protection, and continuity. Both were vulnerable. The tragedy of Alexandria is not simply that its knowledge was lost, but that it was almost saved. It came so close to becoming permanent. Generations of thinkers built upon one another's work, refining, correcting, expanding. This continuity is the rarest achievement in human history. Most civilizations lose their knowledge through conquest, neglect, or forgetting. Alexandria nearly escaped this fate. For centuries, it held the line. But continuity requires more than brilliance. It requires stability, it requires care, and it requires humility before time. As political winds shifted and priorities changed, the library's centrality weakened. What had once been a crown jewel slowly became a background presence, respected but no longer fiercely protected. Knowledge once gathered was assumed to be safe. This assumption would prove fatal. When you imagine the library now, try not to see it in flames just yet. Instead, picture it still standing, scrolls intact, minds at work, ideas breathing quietly. This is the moment of greatest tension, the moment just before loss. It is here that the tragedy truly begins, not with fire, but with complacency.
When people speak of the Library of Alexandria today, they often imagine flames, chaos, and sudden destruction. But the truth is quieter and far more unsettling. Knowledge did not vanish in a single night. It faded. It thinned. It slipped through gaps in attention and care. Scrolls were lost not only to fire, but to neglect, to shifting priorities, to rulers who valued control more than curiosity. The greatest tragedy of Alexandria is not that it burned, but that it became vulnerable. The dream that knowledge, once gathered, could protect itself turned out to be an illusion. As empires changed and power moved inward, the institutions that sustained learning lost their defenders. Scholars left. Funding dried. Debates grew fewer. Ideas that once challenged the boundaries of the possible were copied less often, then not at all. Somewhere in that silence, entire futures quietly disappeared. Imagine what it meant to live at the edge of such understanding, to know that the earth was vast yet measurable, that invisible forces could move matter, that the heavens followed patterns rather than whims. Imagine raising generations within reach of these ideas, then allowing them to fade. The loss was not merely technical, it was psychological. Humanity forgot that it had once stood so close to knowing itself. The lighthouse of Alexandria eventually fell as well, its stones reused, its light extinguished. The sea no longer had a guide, and without the library, the mind lost one too. What remains today are fragments, quotations, second-hand mentions preserved by chance. We reconstruct what we can, like archaeologists of thought, piecing together shadows of brilliance from what survived elsewhere. But reconstruction is not continuity. Something essential is missing. When heroes' devices are mentioned, they feel like curiosities rather than beginnings. When Eratosthenes' measurement is recalled, it feels miraculous rather than inevitable. This distortion matters. It reshapes how we understand progress itself. The story we inherit suggests that advancement is linear, that humanity slowly climbed from ignorance to enlightenment. Alexandria tells a different story. It suggests that knowledge can surge forward, pause, and then recede, leaving later generations to rediscover what was once known. This realization carries a quiet sorrow. It invites us to consider how many other Alexandrias may have existed, briefly shining, then fading without record. As you rest with this thought, let the weight of it soften rather than disturb you. Loss, after all, is part of the human rhythm.
Civilizations inhale insight and exhale forgetting. What matters is not permanence, but the act of reaching. In Alexandria, humanity reached far. It imagined a world guided by reason, observation, and shared understanding. That imagination, even when lost, left an imprint. It resurfaced centuries later, echoing faintly through Renaissance texts, scientific revolutions, and modern inquiry. The library may be gone, but its question remains alive. What could we know if we chose to care deeply enough? As night deepens and your thoughts slow, picture the halls once more, not burning, not collapsing, but empty, waiting. Knowledge sleeps there, not destroyed, just dormant, resting in the long memory of the world. And as we turn away from these quiet corridors, we move toward the next chapter of the Ptolemaic story, where the tools of mind give way to the tools of blood, and where the same desire to control meaning will be turned inward, reshaping family, loyalty, and power itself.
Beneath the polished marble of Alexandria, beneath the festivals, libraries, and carefully designed dreams, there was a secret that never appeared in public proclamations. It was spoken only in hushed voices, passed quietly through palace corridors and guarded by ritual and myth. To rule Egypt fully, the Ptolemies believed they had to become more than Greek kings. They had to become pharaohs. And to become pharaohs, they had to cross a line that Greek tradition had always treated as unthinkable. In the world they came from, marriage between siblings was a violation of nature and order, a boundary that defined civilization itself. In the world they ruled, however, it was something else entirely. Among the gods of Egypt, brother and sister were not merely kin, they were cosmic partners. Osiris and Isis ruled together as siblings and spouses, embodying balance, renewal, and divine continuity. By aligning themselves with this model, the Ptolemies were not seeking scandal, they were seeking legitimacy at the deepest possible level. The transition from foreign rulers to living gods required a transformation that politics alone could not provide. It required blood. This belief reached its most explicit form during the reign of Ptolemy II. He did not simply inherit power, he redefined it. By marrying his sister, Arsinoe, he made a declaration that resonated far beyond the palace walls. This was not a personal union, it was a ritual act, a statement that the dynasty's blood was no longer human in the ordinary sense, but sacred, closed, and complete. They called him Philadelphus, lover of his sister, a title that sounded affectionate on the surface, but carried enormous symbolic weight. To the Greek world, it was unsettling, even disturbing. To Egypt, it was familiar, echoing the patterns of divine rule that had shaped the land for millennia. The court responded with careful choreography. Poets reframed the marriage as harmony. Priests integrated it into existing myth. Coins and statues depicted the royal couple as divine counterparts, serene and eternal. Through repetition, the shocking became normalized. Through ritual, the forbidden became sacred. This was the genius and the danger of the Ptolemaic system. By controlling symbols, they could bend instinct. By repeating myth, they could soften resistance. And for a time, it worked. The people did not revolt. The empire did not collapse. On the surface, stability deepened. But nature does not negotiate with symbolism. Beneath the rituals, beneath the divine language, the human body followed its own rules. Blood closed in on itself, traits repeated, vulnerabilities amplified. The decision to keep the bloodline pure was framed as preservation, but it carried a cost that could not be ritualized away. This cost did not appear immediately. It unfolded slowly, generation by generation.
subtle at first, almost invisible. The early signs were easy to dismiss. Mood swings were called divine temperament. Obsession was interpreted as devotion. Physical changes were stylized in art, exaggerated into symbols of abundance and power. The court learned how to explain everything. But explanation does not equal control. As time passed, the palace atmosphere grew heavier. Trust narrowed. Family ties became political fault lines. When power flows through blood alone, every relative becomes a rival. Every marriage becomes a calculation. Every birth becomes a strategic event. The logic of sacred blood transformed the royal household into a closed system, sealed off from correction, repetition reinforcing repetition. This was not yet madness, not yet collapse. It was something quieter, a slow turning inward, a belief that perfection could be preserved by exclusion. As night falls over the city and the palace lights dim, whispers move through the halls. The marble still gleams, the ceremonies continue, the gods are honored. But the seed has been planted. The dynasty has chosen covenant over nature, myth over balance. And in doing so, it has set itself on a path where the very thing meant to preserve power will begin, gently and relentlessly, to erode it from within.
As the generations passed, the decision that once felt symbolic began to express itself in quieter, more personal ways. The palace, once a place of ceremony and confidence, slowly transformed into an environment of heightened sensitivity. Small changes were noticed, then dismissed, then quietly managed. The body, after all, does not announce its limits loudly at first. It whispers. Traits that had once appeared rarely began to repeat with greater frequency. Physical softness became common, not as indulgence, but as inheritance. The eyes of later rulers seemed heavier, more distant, as if the weight of lineage pressed inward. Physicians were summoned more often, remedies multiplied, explanations followed. Everything could be named, categorized, ritualized, and yet naming does not undo cause. The logic of royal incest promised continuity, but continuity without variation is stagnation. Inbreeding effects are not sudden catastrophes, they are slow compressions. Diversity narrows, resilience fades. What might have been absorbed by a broader gene pool instead accumulates, quietly, patiently. Within the Ptolemaic household, this accumulation expressed itself as temperament first. Irritability became unpredictability. Confidence slipped into suspicion. Certainty hardened into fixation. These shifts were interpreted through the language of divinity. A volatile mood was framed as the burden of godhood. Paranoia became vigilance. Excess became abundance. Art reinforced these interpretations, smoothing sharp edges into symbols. Statues emphasized fullness as prosperity. Public appearances masked fragility with splendor. The court learned to perform stability, but performance requires constant attention, and attention breeds anxiety. The closer the family drew inward, the more the outside world felt threatening. Advisors were trusted less. Siblings watched one another more closely. Marriage ceased to be a bridge and became a lock. Children were raised not merely as heirs, but as vessels of continuity, burdened with expectations they could neither escape nor fully understand. This pressure reshaped relationships at their core. Affection became conditional, loyalty became transactional. Love, when it existed, was inseparable from strategy. The language of family blended with the language of power until neither could be distinguished. In such an environment, fear does not need a cause, it becomes ambient. Decisions are made defensively,
Accusations feel preventative rather than cruel. The palace grows quieter, not from peace, but from caution. Conversations shorten, trust thins. The dynasty's belief in sacred blood, once a source of legitimacy, now functions as a narrowing lens through which all actions are judged. Any deviation feels like contamination. Any dissent feels like betrayal. The system reinforces itself. Those who benefit from it defend it most fiercely. Those who suffer within it lack the distance to name the problem. Biology and belief intertwine until separating them feels impossible. This is how decline often begins, not with collapse, but with internal reinforcement. The body adapts, the mind rationalizes, the structure persists. From the outside, the Ptolemaic state still appears powerful. Rituals continue, borders hold, wealth flows. But inside the family, something essential is eroding: adaptability, trust, the capacity to absorb difference. As night settles and the palace rests, the consequences of earlier choices circulate quietly, like blood itself, reaching every chamber. No single moment marks the turning point. There is no announcement, only a gradual shift where preservation becomes confinement, impurity becomes pressure. The covenant that once promised eternity now demands constant vigilance, and vigilance over time becomes exhaustion.
Eventually, the pressure that had been quietly building within the royal bloodline could no longer remain contained. What had begun as ritual hardened into expectation, and expectation hardened into entitlement. The belief that power was encoded in blood reshaped how the Ptolemies understood morality itself. Actions that would have been unthinkable for ordinary rulers became justifiable within the closed logic of the dynasty. When authority is sacred, opposition feels blasphemous. When family embodies the state, conflict within the household becomes political necessity. This is how violence entered, not as an accident, but as a tool. Suspicion grew where trust once existed. Every illness raised questions. Every delay felt intentional. Every sibling, spouse, or child represented both continuity and threat. In such an atmosphere, fear does not erupt suddenly. It settles. It becomes routine. Decisions are made in anticipation of betrayal rather than evidence of it. Eliminating a rival feels like prevention, not cruelty. Within the Ptolemaic court, this logic produced a pattern that would repeat with chilling regularity. Arrests were framed as protection. Exile was described as mercy. Death, when it came, was spoken of in whispers, wrapped in ceremony, absorbed into the rhythm of governance. The dynasty did not collapse because of one act of violence, but because violence became normalized as governance. Each generation inherited not only power, but precedent. Children grew up watching how problems were solved. They learned early that survival depended on proximity to authority and distance from vulnerability. Love became dangerous. Affection created leverage. To care deeply was to expose oneself. This emotional contraction was perhaps the most devastating effect of the covenant. The bloodline, once meant to unify divinity and rule, produced isolation instead. The palace filled with bodies, but emptied of trust. Over time, paranoia and physical decline reinforced one another. Weakness fed suspicion, suspicion fueled aggression, aggression justified further control. The cycle tightened. Outsiders were excluded, advisors silenced. Reality narrowed until only the dynasty's own reflection remained, and reflections, when unchallenged, distort. By the later years of Ptolemaic rule, the family had become a closed echo chamber
repeating its own myths while losing contact with the world it governed. The very symbols that once inspired reverence now provoked unease. The gods felt distant, rituals felt hollow. The people sensed instability even when they could not name it. Power, once grounded in knowledge, then in divine imagery, now relied increasingly on fear. This transition marked the true beginning of the end. A state can survive weakness, it can survive decadence, it rarely survives fear turned inward. As night settles over Alexandria and the palace grows still, the covenant reveals its final shape. What was meant to preserve eternity has accelerated decay. What was meant to protect purity has produced fragmentation. The dynasty's greatest strength, its sacred blood, has become its most corrosive element. And yet, there is a strange calm in this realization. The pattern is not unique. History repeats it quietly across cultures and centuries. When power closes itself off, when it mistakes isolation for stability, it begins to erode from within. The Ptolemies believed they could outwit nature by ritualizing it. They believed they could suspend change by sanctifying blood. Instead, they magnified the very forces they feared. As you rest with this thought, allow it to soften rather than disturb you. The story of the Ptolemaic covenant is not merely a tale of taboo and violence. It is a meditation on limits, on what happens when human systems refuse to adapt. And as we move toward the next chapter, where external powers and shifting empires begin to press in on Egypt's borders, remember that the collapse has already begun. It began quietly, in marriage chambers, in nurseries, in the spaces where love and power became indistinguishable.
After every golden age, there is a quieter season where brilliance fades into habit and habit into excess. For the Ptolemaic Dynasty, this transition did not arrive with a single catastrophe. It crept in through comfort. Power no longer needed to prove itself. Authority inherited certainty without earning it. The later rulers were born into marble halls and sacred titles, surrounded by rituals that told them who they were long before they understood what ruling required. Ptolemy IV Philopator emerged from this environment not as a warrior or a scholar, but as a product of insulation. Governance became something delegated, pleasure became something expected. The machinery of state continued to turn, but its guiding hand grew distant. Decisions were made slowly, filtered through favorites and flatterers, while the world beyond the palace walls grew restless. Rebellions in the countryside were no longer distant rumors, they were symptoms. When rulers withdraw from responsibility, reality fills the vacuum. The army sensed neglect, the people sensed indifference. Alexandria, once a city bound together by shared dreams, began to fracture into factions, each responding differently to the absence of moral authority. Some retreated into cynicism, others into anger. The palace responded not with reform, but with denial. Rituals intensified as governance weakened, as if repetition alone could restore legitimacy. Over time, the language of rule shifted. Where earlier kings spoke of harmony and order, later rulers spoke of loyalty and punishment. Power became reactive, control replaced vision. This shift mattered profoundly. A civilization can endure corruption longer than it can endure emptiness at the center. As trust erodes, fear takes its place, and fear, once normalized, reshapes behavior across all levels of society. Within the royal household, the narrowing of perspective continued. Family disputes escalated, court politics grew harsher, survival became a daily calculation.
Into this atmosphere stepped Ptolemy VIII, remembered by the cruel nickname Physcon, a word that reduced a ruler to his body, to appetite and excess. The name itself reveals how far reverence had fallen. A king once embodied cosmic order, now he was mocked in the streets. Physcon inherited a realm already weakened, but he responded not with restraint, but with amplification. Where insecurity existed, he applied force. Where doubt lingered, he enforced silence. His rule marked a turning point, not because it introduced cruelty, but because it abandoned shame. Actions that earlier generations would have concealed were now performed openly as warnings rather than secrets. The palace ceased to be a sanctuary of distance. It became a theater of intimidation. And yet, even as fears spread, it failed to command respect. Alexandria's people had changed. Centuries of exposure to power had taught them something dangerous to tyrants. They had learned that rulers were not eternal. They had seen gods fall from favor before. Laughter returned to the streets, sharp and public. Mockery became a weapon. The crowd, once guided by symbols, now tested them. This was the moment when authority and audience collided. A city trained in observation turned its gaze inward, scrutinizing its own kings, and in that scrutiny something irreversible began. As night settles over Alexandria in this period, the air feels heavier, charged with tension rather than curiosity. The lamps still glow, the harbor still breathes, but the city no longer dreams together. It watches, it waits. The dynasty, already compromised by blood and fear, has entered its most unstable phase. The madness to come is not sudden. It is the logical outcome of insulation, excess, and the slow decay of responsibility.
As Ptolemy VIII Physcon tightened his grip on power, the palace ceased to be merely a seat of rule and became a mirror of his inner state. Excess no longer hid behind ceremony. It occupied space openly. Feasts grew longer, judgments shorter. The body of the king, heavy and unrestrained, became a symbol not of prosperity, but of imbalance. Yet the imbalance was not physical alone. It was psychological, and it radiated outward. Physcon ruled with a constant sense of threat, real or imagined. The earlier logic of sacred blood had narrowed the dynasty's world. Now fear compressed it further. Every disagreement felt like an attack. Every whisper sounded like conspiracy. The line between governance and personal vendetta dissolved. Decisions that affected thousands were shaped by moods that shifted within hours. Advisors learned to read silences rather than words. Survival depended not on wisdom, but on timing. In this climate, cruelty did not need explanation. It became a language. Punishment served not only to remove opposition, but to communicate dominance. The city felt these shifts immediately. Alexandria had always been unusually sensitive to power. Its people were educated, observant, and accustomed to interpreting symbols. When leadership became erratic, they noticed. When authority lost dignity, they responded. But they did not respond with organized resistance. They responded with something far less predictable: the crowd. Alexandria's mobs were not spontaneous explosions. They were collective organisms shaped by frustration, humor, memory, and proximity. Streets that once hosted philosophical debate now carried sharp commentary. Songs and jokes spread faster than proclamations. Ridicule traveled through marketplaces, undermining fear with laughter. Physcon's image became distorted in the public imagination, not through official rebellion, but through repetition of mockery.
This mattered because ridicule corrodes legitimacy faster than violence. A tyrant can rule over silence, but not over laughter. As trust between ruler and city dissolved, both sides hardened. Physcon responded with harsher measures, believing fear could restore control. The crowd responded by withdrawing reverence altogether. Respect vanished first, then patience. Alexandria became volatile not because it lacked order, but because it possessed too much memory. The people remembered better kings. They remembered libraries, festivals of learning, moments when power had felt purposeful. That memory sharpened their disappointment. In such an environment, violence became cyclical. Harsh rule provoked unrest. Unrest justified harsher rule. The palace and the streets mirrored each other, each escalating in response to the other's excess. This feedback loop is the signature of declining civilizations. It is not collapse, but oscillation. Stability is replaced by reaction. Long-term vision disappears. Everything becomes immediate. Physcon's reign exemplified this pattern. He ruled longer than many expected, not because he was strong, but because the system had already lost the ability to correct itself. Institutions that once absorbed shock now transmitted it. Fear traveled downward, anger traveled upward. Between them, nothing softened impact. Families learned caution. Silence became currency. Public life narrowed. Even loyalty grew conditional. People waited, they watched, they endured. And endurance over time reshapes societies. It erodes hope quietly. As night falls over Alexandria during these years, the city does not sleep easily. Sounds linger, conversations pause mid-sentence, lamps burn later than before. The harbor remains busy, but its rhythm feels tense rather than hopeful. From the palace, decrees arrive heavier, stripped of persuasion. From the streets, responses come quicker, stripped of awe. The dynasty's madness is not theatrical insanity. It is a slow disintegration of shared meaning. When ruler and ruled no longer inhabit the same reality, power becomes brittle. And brittle things, no matter how imposing, break suddenly.
In the final years of this dark chapter, Alexandria itself became the stage where power and madness confronted one another openly. The city had always been restless, but now its restlessness hardened into something sharper. The people no longer whispered their dissatisfaction. They spoke it aloud, in groups, in public, carried by the confidence that fear had already taken too much from them to matter anymore. The relationship between ruler and city inverted. Where kings once shaped the mood of the streets now shaped the fate of kings. Physcon's authority existed only as long as the crowd tolerated it. When that tolerance vanished, violence followed not as chaos, but as judgment. Alexandria's lynch mobs were infamous not because they were irrational, but because they were deliberate. The crowd moved with memory. It remembered humiliation, hunger, broken promises, and public cruelty. When anger finally surfaced, it did so with terrifying focus. This was not the violence of ignorance, but the violence of disillusionment. A dynasty that once ruled by intellect now faced a population that understood power all too well. Kings could still command soldiers, but they could no longer command belief. And belief is the true currency of empire. As this internal decay accelerated, something else shifted quietly beyond Egypt's borders. From the west, Rome watched, not with urgency, but with patience. Roman senators and generals did not see madness as a threat. They saw it as opportunity.
Egypt was still wealthy. Its grain still fed cities. Its ports still connected continents. But its rulers were no longer coherent. Decisions contradicted one another. Alliances shifted without strategy. Authority fractured. To Rome, this was not tragedy, it was timing. While the Ptolemies turned inward, consumed by paranoia and spectacle, Rome expanded outward, methodical and disciplined. The contrast could not have been sharper. One civilization dissolved into reaction, the other refined control. The fall of civilizations rarely comes from a single enemy. It comes when internal weakness invites external order. Alexandria's streets sensed this change even before the palace did. The mood shifted from outrage to resignation. Laughter faded, anger dulled. People began to speak of Rome not with fear, but with inevitability. This is the final stage of decline, when resistance transforms into expectation, when domination feels like relief. The dynasty's madness had exhausted its audience. Viscon's legacy was not merely cruelty, it was fatigue, a weariness that spread through institutions and families alike. By the time his reign ended, the Ptolemaic state no longer collapsed dramatically, it sagged, it yielded. Power slipped away through treaties, interventions, and invitations extended to Rome in moments of desperation. The eagle did not need to strike, it only needed to land. As night settles over Alexandria in these final moments of the chapter, the city feels older. The harbor lights flicker. The crowds disperse earlier. The palace stands, but it no longer commands the horizon. What began generations earlier with knowledge, ambition, and divine imagery has arrived here at a place of quiet surrender. Madness did not destroy the dynasty in a single blow. It thinned it, it hollowed it, it made it manageable. And that is often how history ends, not with fire alone, but with silence filled by a new order waiting calmly to take its place. As we drift toward the next chapter, remember this pattern. Civilizations fall not when they are defeated, but when they forget how to hold themselves together.
When the world of the Ptolemies seemed exhausted, frayed by madness and fear, a different kind of presence emerged along the Nile. Cleopatra VII did not arrive as a conqueror, she arrived as a reader of patterns. From the beginning, she understood something her predecessors had forgotten. Egypt was not merely a throne to inherit, it was a civilization to be spoken to. While earlier rulers relied on ritual and blood to command obedience, Cleopatra turned toward comprehension. She listened, she learned. She chose to speak the language of the land she ruled, not as a gesture, but as a strategy. This alone set her apart. For the first time in generations, a Ptolemaic ruler addressed Egypt not through translators or symbols, but directly. This choice reshaped how power flowed around her. Cleopatra's education had been deliberate and wide. She moved easily among texts, histories, philosophies, and sciences. Words were her instruments. She could shift tone as easily as she shifted alliances. Where others relied on fear, she relied on presence. Where others imposed, she persuaded. This was not softness, it was precision. In a court accustomed to excess and suspicion, her clarity felt disarming. But clarity can be dangerous. Cleopatra inherited a fractured kingdom and a dangerous family. Her rise immediately provoked resistance, particularly from her younger brother, whose claim to power was supported by those who feared her independence. Civil war was not a choice, it was the environment. Rather than retreat, Cleopatra calculated. She understood timing.
She understood that Egypt's fate no longer rested solely within its borders. Rome loomed to the west, disciplined, expanding, attentive. The old dynasty had learned to fear Rome. Cleopatra learned to engage it. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, he did not come as a guest, he came as an arbiter. Egypt's internal conflict had become Rome's opportunity to intervene. Cleopatra did not wait to be summoned, she acted. The story of her entrance has been told many times, often embellished, but its essence remains striking. She chose risk over invisibility. Smuggled into Caesar's presence, concealed not by weakness but by audacity, she reframed the encounter before it began. This was not seduction in the simple sense, it was a demonstration, a statement that she would not be managed by circumstance. That night, Cleopatra did not plead for survival, she negotiated for relevance. She presented herself not as a victim of dynastic chaos, but as its solution. Caesar, a man who recognized intelligence when he saw it, responded accordingly. Their alliance was not born of romance alone, it was born of mutual recognition. Cleopatra saw Rome's power clearly. Caesar saw Egypt's value clearly. Together, they paused the dynasty's collapse, not reversed it, paused it. And sometimes, time is the rarest currency of all. As the Nile flows quietly beside the palace, carrying reflections of moonlight and marble, Cleopatra's presence settles into the city. She does not shout, she does not rush. She waits, watches, and calculates. In a world that has grown loud with violence and fear, her calm feels almost unnatural. This is her true Siren song. Not beauty, not charm, but the steady pull of intellect drawing power toward itself.
After that first night of calculated daring, Cleopatra's position within Alexandria shifted almost imperceptibly, yet profoundly. She was no longer merely a claimant to the throne. She became a presence Caesar had to consider in every equation. While others at court spoke loudly, Cleopatra spoke precisely. She understood that power, especially Roman power, was not impressed by spectacle alone. It responded to clarity, loyalty, and advantage. Cleopatra offered all three, but never freely. She framed Egypt not as a burden, but as a stabilizing force Rome could rely on. Grain, wealth, ports, and legitimacy flowed through her words with practiced ease. Caesar, seasoned by decades of conquest and political survival, recognized something rare. Cleopatra did not seek to dominate him, nor did she submit. She aligned. This alignment reshaped Egypt's civil war. With Roman backing, Cleopatra moved swiftly to neutralize her rivals. The struggle against her brother ended not as a dramatic victory, but as a quiet resolution enforced by inevitability. Power returned to the palace, but it was no longer insulated. Rome's shadow now stretched across marble halls and temple courts alike. Cleopatra accepted this with open eyes. She never confused partnership with equality. Instead, she focused on influence. Influence, she knew, outlived brute control. During Caesar's stay in Egypt, the city breathed differently. The tension that had gripped Alexandria softened. Trade resumed its rhythm. Public life steadied. Cleopatra appeared not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. She moved through the city with deliberate visibility, speaking to priests, scholars, and merchants in ways no Ptolemaic ruler had done before. Her command of language allowed her to inhabit multiple identities at once. To the Egyptians, she was pharaoh. To the Greeks, she was queen. To the Romans, she was an ally. This fluidity was her genius, but it was also her vulnerability.
When Caesar departed Egypt, he left behind more than a political arrangement. He left behind a connection that bound Egypt's fate even tighter to Rome's internal struggles. Cleopatra understood the danger. She also understood the necessity. Isolation meant extinction. Engagement offered survival, however uncertain. When she later traveled to Rome, arriving not as a captive but as a sovereign, the contrast between her world and Rome's became stark. Rome admired her, distrusted her, and watched her carefully. She did not seek to blend in. She allowed difference to become leverage. Her presence unsettled Roman expectations, particularly those of senators who viewed monarchy with suspicion. Yet Caesar's protection shielded her, temporarily. For Cleopatra, time was always temporary. She measured it not in years, but in windows of opportunity. Caesar's assassination shattered one such window. The alliance that had stabilized Egypt collapsed overnight. Once again, Cleopatra stood at the edge of history, watching power realign without warning. But she did not retreat into mourning. She recalculated. Egypt had survived because she adapted faster than events unfolded. The Siren of the Nile did not sing to enchant. She sang to navigate storms. As Caesar's death sent ripples through Rome, Cleopatra returned to Egypt carrying both loss and clarity. Rome was no longer unified. New players would emerge, new dangers would follow. But Cleopatra had learned the rules of engagement. She had spoken with Rome's greatest mind. She had watched how empires fracture, and she understood that survival now depended on choosing the right Roman at the right moment with the right balance of devotion and distance. The Nile flowed on, indifferent to Roman knives and Senate votes. Cleopatra watched it and waited.
After Caesar's death, the world Cleopatra had carefully stabilized, fractured once more. But this time, the fracture lines were clearer. Rome no longer moved as a single force. It split into ambitions, loyalties, and unfinished promises. Cleopatra understood that this division was both danger and invitation. Where unity had limited her options, fragmentation expanded them. Among the new centers of Roman power stood Mark Antony, a man unlike Caesar in temperament, yet similar in reach. Antony was not a planner in the same way. He was emotional, theatrical, driven by loyalty and appetite rather than restraint. Cleopatra recognized this immediately. She did not approach him as she had approached Caesar. She adjusted. When they met, it was not in secrecy, but in spectacle. She arrived not hidden, but illuminated. Egypt announced itself through her presence, through music, through ceremony, through confidence. Antony did not merely see a queen, he felt a world that contrasted sharply with Rome's tightening austerity. Their connection unfolded quickly, but it was never simple indulgence. Cleopatra offered Antony something Rome could not: affirmation without judgment, partnership without condescension, and a vision where he stood at the center rather than the margins of power. In return, Antony offered Egypt protection, legitimacy, and a future aligned against Rome's colder calculations. For a time, this exchange worked. Egypt flourished again. Alexandria revived its sense of celebration. The court felt alive rather than anxious. Cleopatra and Antony ruled not just as allies, but as symbols. Together, they represented an alternative to Rome's rigid hierarchy. Yet this very alternative provoked Rome's fear. Octavian, Caesar's heir, understood the threat clearly.
He reframed the narrative not as a political rivalry, but as a moral one. Cleopatra became, in Roman rhetoric, not a sovereign, but a seductress corrupting a Roman general. Antony became weak, distracted, compromised. This framing was deliberate. Rome did not need to defeat Egypt militarily at first, it needed to delegitimize it. Cleopatra had always known perception was power. This time, perception turned against her. Antony, increasingly torn between Rome and Egypt, began to falter. Decisions slowed, hesitations multiplied. Cleopatra sensed the shift. The Siren who had guided storms now faced one she could not redirect. The Battle of Actium sealed the narrative, not merely as a military defeat, but as a symbolic one. Rome's discipline overcame Egypt's display. Strategy overcame spectacle. After Actium, Cleopatra's options narrowed rapidly. Yet even in defeat, she refused humiliation. She returned to Egypt not as a fugitive, but as a ruler preparing the end on her own terms. Antony's death closed one chapter of her life, but not her resolve. Cleopatra's final acts were not driven by despair, they were driven by control. She understood that Rome could conquer Egypt, but it could not own her narrative unless she allowed it. By choosing her own end, she preserved the last fragment of sovereignty available to her. With Cleopatra, the Ptolemaic Dynasty did not collapse in madness, it concluded in clarity. The Siren's song faded, not because it failed, but because the world around it had changed. Rome's order replaced Egypt's fluid brilliance. The Nile continued to flow, indifferent, eternal. And as the night settles over this chapter, we are left not with scandal, but with understanding. Cleopatra was never merely a beauty. She was a mind navigating the final tides of an ancient civilization, holding it together long enough for history to remember it as more than a footnote.
After Caesar's assassination, the world Cleopatra had once navigated with careful precision hardened into something less forgiving. The fractures within Rome widened, but they did not dissolve, they reorganized. Cleopatra understood that the era of subtle balance was ending. Survival now demanded commitment, not calibration, and so she placed her final wager on Mark Antony. Together, they did not merely form an alliance, they built a shared reality, a world apart from Rome's tightening grip. In Alexandria, life unfolded with deliberate excess, not as indulgence alone, but as defiance. They called themselves the inimitable livers, not to boast, but to declare independence from Roman restraint. Feasts stretched into dawn, ceremonies merged Greek, Egyptian, and personal symbolism. Cleopatra understood the power of myth, and she wrapped their union in it. Antony, drawn by emotion and affirmation, embraced this vision. For a time, it worked. Egypt felt alive again. The court moved with confidence rather than fear. Cleopatra ruled beside Antony not as a shadow, but as a partner. Yet, beneath the splendor, the mechanics of Rome continued to turn. Octavian did not challenge Antony with passion or spectacle, he challenged him with patience. While Alexandria celebrated identity, Rome refined discipline. While Antony invested in presence, Octavian invested in logistics. Cleopatra sensed the imbalance early. She urged consolidation. She urged caution. But Antony's nature leaned toward loyalty over calculation. Each Roman concession to Egypt became ammunition for Octavian's narrative. Slowly, the story shifted. This was no longer a civil struggle among Romans. It became, in Roman eyes, a confrontation between order and temptation. Cleopatra was cast as the foreign influence undermining Roman virtue. Antony became the general who had forgotten Rome.
This framing did not need to be true, it only needed to be repeated. Cleopatra understood the danger of perception more than anyone. She responded not with apology, but with resolve. The final gamble was not merely military, it was existential. If Egypt could not stand beside Rome as an equal force, it would be absorbed as a prize. Cleopatra chose to resist absorption through commitment. At sea, preparations accelerated. Fleets assembled not only from strategy, but from belief. The ships carried more than soldiers. They carried the hope that spectacle could still counter steel, that legacy could still confront machinery. As the Mediterranean darkened with approaching conflict, Cleopatra remained composed. She had already calculated loss as a possibility. What she refused was humiliation. This distinction guided every decision that followed. For Cleopatra, defeat was tolerable, erasure was not. And so, as the winds gathered toward Actium, she stood beside Antony not as a lover clinging to romance, but as a sovereign defending the final expression of her world.
As dawn rose over the waters near Actium, the sea carried a tension that could not be mistaken for chance. This was not merely a battle between fleets, it was a confrontation between two philosophies of power. On one side stood Antony and Cleopatra, their ships larger, more ornate, designed to impress as much as to fight. They represented a world where authority flowed through presence, loyalty, and shared identity. On the other side waited Octavian's forces, quieter, leaner, organized with ruthless efficiency. Their ships were not beautiful, they were functional. Every plank, every oar, every formation existed for a single purpose: victory. Cleopatra watched the horizon with a stillness that masked calculation. She had known for some time that the odds were shifting, yet she also knew that once committed, withdrawal was no longer weakness, but choice. As the battle unfolded, confusion spread quickly across the water. Antony's commanders struggled to adapt to Octavian's tactics. The Roman fleet moved not as individuals, but as a system. When one ship faltered, another replaced it. When one line broke, another closed. Cleopatra observed this pattern with growing clarity. This was not chaos, this was machinery. In that moment, she understood something fundamental. Egypt was fighting not an enemy, but an era. The age of spectacle had reached its limit. The age of administration had arrived. When Cleopatra chose to withdraw her fleet, history would later reduce the moment to panic or betrayal. But this simplification misses the truth. Her decision was not driven by fear, it was driven by recognition. She saw that continuing would not preserve Egypt's sovereignty, it would only deepen its destruction. By retreating, she preserved one remaining variable: time. Antony followed, torn between duty and devotion. His choice sealed the narrative. Rome would remember Actium not only as a victory, but as proof of Antony's supposed weakness. Cleopatra would be remembered as the foreign queen who distracted him. The machinery of propaganda activated immediately. Yet beneath this narrative lay a quieter reality. Cleopatra had read the battle correctly. Octavian did not need a dramatic triumph. He needed confirmation that resistance was fractured. Actium provided it. In the aftermath, the world shifted rapidly. Allies vanished, support dissolved. The Mediterranean recalibrated itself around Roman certainty. Cleopatra returned to Egypt carrying not illusion, but knowledge. She knew now that the final act would not be played out at sea. It would unfold within walls, within chambers, within decisions made in silence. The Siren of the Nile did not wail in defeat. She adjusted her song. After Actium, the war did not end with a final clash. It dissolved.
Momentum slipped away from Antony and Cleopatra, not in a single blow, but through silence, hesitation, and abandonment. Roman allies withdrew their support quietly. Supplies failed to arrive. Messages went unanswered. Antony, once defined by certainty and command, found himself surrounded by echoes rather than loyalty. Cleopatra observed this unraveling with a composure that masked grief. She understood that the war had already been decided elsewhere, not on the battlefield, but in Rome's political imagination. When Octavian advanced toward Egypt, he did so not as a conqueror seeking battle, but as an administrator arriving to claim inheritance. Antony attempted resistance one final time, but his world had narrowed beyond recovery. Miscommunication and despair overtook resolve. Believing Cleopatra dead, he chose to end his life by the sword. The act was not dramatic triumph, but quiet exhaustion. When Cleopatra learned of his death, she did not collapse into spectacle. She mourned privately, deliberately. Antony's death clarified the last remaining truth. There would be no negotiated survival. Rome did not intend to preserve Egypt's sovereignty, it intended to display its conquest. Cleopatra understood what awaited her: chains, procession, humiliation before Roman crowds eager to see the foreign queen reduced to proof of Rome's superiority. For Cleopatra, this outcome was unacceptable. Her entire life had been shaped by the control of narrative, by the understanding that how one is remembered often matters more than how one dies. She prepared carefully, not in panic, but in order. When Octavian entered Alexandria, he found a city subdued, resigned. Cleopatra did not beg, she did not bargain for life at the cost of dignity. She requested time. Time to arrange her affairs, time to dress, time to choose. The accounts of her death vary, and history has never resolved them fully. A serpent concealed in a basket, a hidden poison, perhaps something else entirely. The uncertainty itself is meaningful. Cleopatra denied Rome the clarity of ownership over her end. When Octavian finally entered the chamber, he did not find a defeated captive. He found a queen lying still upon a golden bed, adorned not as a prisoner, but as a ruler at rest. In that moment, the Ptolemaic Dynasty ended not with madness or collapse, but with intention. Cleopatra's death marked the transition of Egypt from an ancient kingdom into a Roman province, but it also preserved something intangible: agency. The Siren of the Nile did not fade screaming. She faded in silence, leaving behind a story that Rome could not fully rewrite. The Nile continued its course, indifferent to empires. Alexandria adjusted to a new order. Temples remained, stones endured, but something subtle had passed, a way of ruling that blended intellect, identity, and myth, yielded to a system built on law, efficiency, and control. As this chapter closes, we are left not with scandal, but with reflection. Cleopatra's last gamble was not love alone, nor war alone. It was the refusal to surrender the meaning of her life to another power. And in that refusal, she ensured that the last queen of Egypt would be remembered not as a footnote to Rome, but as the final voice of a civilization choosing its own ending.
After Cleopatra's death, Egypt did not scream. It went quiet. There was no final uprising, no last chorus of resistance echoing through Alexandria's streets. The transition was administrative, efficient, and cold. Rome did not need drama. It needed certainty. Egypt was reorganized not as a kingdom, but as a resource. Fields were measured, grain was counted, taxes were recalculated. What had once been the heart of an ancient civilization became a vital organ of a larger body. Roman Egypt was not conquered in the way stories often imagine. It was absorbed, and absorption leaves little noise behind. Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, represented the final unresolved variable, a living reminder of both Caesar and Egypt's sovereignty. To Rome, this was not legacy, it was risk. The decision was made with chilling clarity. Too many Caesars are dangerous. Caesarion's death was not vengeance, it was policy. With him, the bloodline ended, not with ceremony, but with silence. The Ptolemaic Dynasty, after 3 centuries of power, vanished completely. No heirs, no restorations, no return. The desert accepted them without distinction. Alexandria continued to exist, but its purpose shifted. The city no longer dreamed, it functioned. The lighthouse still stood for a time, guiding Roman ships rather than Ptolemaic ambition. The library lingered in memory more than in structure, its spirit diluted as priorities changed. Knowledge became practical, administration replaced curiosity. Over generations, earthquakes would topple monuments, fires would erase texts. Time would do what armies could not. It would make even greatness ordinary. Yet something lingered. Not power, not territory, memory. Rome ruled Egypt for centuries, but it never truly replaced the echo of what had been there before. The silence that settled over the desert was not emptiness, it was saturation. Every grain of sand held layers of story. Every ruin whispered choices once made. Power had passed on, as it always does. What remained was lesson. The Stoics understood this well. Control is temporary. Possession is illusion. What endures is alignment with nature's rhythm. The Ptolemies fought that rhythm. Cleopatra understood it too late to reverse history, but early enough to choose dignity. In the end, Egypt did not fall because it was weak. It fell because the world around it had changed, and change does not negotiate. As the night deepens and the fire's embers glow softly, history does not demand judgment, it offers perspective. Empires rise, believing themselves permanent. They fall, surprised that time never noticed. Sleep gently now, knowing that even the mightiest names fade into the same quiet desert.
In the years that followed, Roman Egypt settled into a rhythm that felt steady, efficient, and quietly unfamiliar. Governors replaced kings. Edicts replaced decrees spoken in divine tones. The temples still stood, but their ceremonies changed pace. The gods were not erased, only reorganized, folded into a wider imperial order that valued consistency over wonder. Alexandria remained a city of stone and harbor winds, yet its pulse slowed. Scholars still gathered, but fewer questions were asked that did not serve an immediate purpose. Ships arrived daily, carrying grain toward Rome, their hulls heavy with Egypt's fertility. The Nile continued its ancient flood, indifferent to banners and borders, but the meaning assigned to its waters had shifted. It was no longer sacred breath, it was yield. The lighthouse of Pharaoh still rose against the horizon for a time, its fire cutting through coastal darkness, but even it felt diminished, no longer a symbol of human reach toward knowledge, but a tool of navigation for imperial commerce. Earthquakes would eventually crack its stones, winds would scatter its memory. The library, too, lived on more as an idea than a place. Scrolls were lost gradually, not always to flame, but to neglect, to irrelevance, to the quiet decisions of what was worth preserving and what was not. History rarely vanishes in a single night. It fades through omission, through silence, through the absence of voices once heard daily. The Ptolemies themselves became distant echoes. Their names survived on coins, in marginal notes, in whispered legends told long after the truth had blurred. Cleopatra's image lingered longest, reshaped and softened by Roman retelling, turned into symbol rather than sovereign. Yet beneath these reinterpretations, the land remembered differently. The desert does not care who ruled it. Sand covers palaces and hovels alike. Time smooths the sharp edges of ambition. Travelers crossing Egypt generations later would pass ruins without knowing whose dreams once animated them. A fallen column, a half-buried statue, a harbor wall eroded by salt and tide. These remnants did not speak loudly. They murmured. They carried the residue of lives lived intensely and then released. Power, once so fiercely contested, became indistinguishable from dust. Rome itself would one day learn this truth, though it could not yet imagine it. For now, Egypt slept beneath administration and routine. Not dead, not alive as before, something in between. A civilization resting after a long vigil. As the desert wind moved across dunes and broken stone, it carried no judgment, only continuity. And in that continuity, history softened, allowing the past to settle gently into the night.
And so the desert remains. Long after banners fall and names fade, the sand keeps its own rhythm. The footsteps of soldiers disappear first, then the outlines of cities soften. Alexandria, once bright with ambition and argument, learns to exist without urgency. Its streets still fill with voices, but they no longer carry the weight of destiny. The palace where Cleopatra once waited grows quiet, its rooms repurposed, its memories diluted by time. Caesarion's name lingers only briefly, a whisper carried by historians rather than by blood. Rome moves on, confident, structured, convinced of permanence, yet permanence never settles anywhere for long. The same winds that brushed against Ptolemaic sails now move across Roman standards. The same Nile that fed emperors will one day watch them pass. What remains of the dynasty is not power, nor scandal, nor tragedy. It is atmosphere, a sense that something once stood here and mattered deeply to those who lived within it. The lighthouse no longer shines, but the coastline remembers its glow. The library no longer gathers voices, but the idea of it still draws the curious. These absences are not empty, they are full of echoes. History does not always end with a sound. Sometimes it ends with a pause, a long one. In that pause, imagination replaces certainty. Stories soften, sharp edges blur. What was once urgent becomes distant, and distance is kind. As night deepens and the world slows, Egypt rests beneath stars that have watched countless rulers rise and vanish. The desert offers no applause, no condemnation, only space, only time. If you listen closely, you may hear nothing at all, and that nothing is complete. Let the final embers fade. Let the wind pass without direction. Let history sleep now alongside you.